The first sign was often nothing at all, a small patch of skin on the arm that had gone numb, that you could pinch or prick or hold a candle near and feel nothing from. No pain, no heat, no warning. In a world without much understanding of disease, a person might not even notice it for months, might only find out by accident, a burn that didn't hurt, a cut they never felt happen. And that quiet little absence, that one dead spot of skin, was the opening move of the disease that medieval Europe feared more than almost any other. Leprosy worked in silence at the start, through the failure of the body to feel, and by the time anyone understood what that silence meant, it was already too late to do anything about it. That's the strange cruelty sitting at the center of it, where most of the diseases we're going to talk about today come crashing in with fever and blood and screaming pain. This one slips in through numbness. The body's alarm system simply switches off, one patch at a time, and the rot that follows is able to do its work precisely because the person can no longer feel it happening. Welcome in. Thank you for being here, and a real thank you to everyone supporting the channel, because these longer videos take quite a while to put together, and your support is what actually keeps the lights on around here. While you're getting settled, do me a favor and drop a comment. Right. So today we're spending some real time with 6 diseases that shaped what it meant to be alive in the medieval world, and more to the point, what it meant to suffer in it. Leprosy, tuberculosis, syphilis, dysentery, smallpox, and a strange burning sickness called ergotism that turned people's limbs black and made them fall off while the person was still breathing and talking. None of this is comfortable. That's sort of the whole point of it. These were the things people truly feared, the things that emptied villages and killed kings and turned ordinary human faces into something children fled from in the street. And the people who endured them were exactly that, people, with names and parents and children and a deep animal terror of what was happening to their own bodies. I'm going to try to keep them human the entire way through, because it's easy to turn a medical history into a list of symptoms and forget that every symptom was happening to somebody. Let's stay with the one we started on, the slow one. Leprosy is, in its own way, the cruelest disease on this whole list. And not because it killed fast. It didn't kill fast at all. There's almost something patient about its arithmetic. The bacterium behind it grows so slowly inside the body that a person could carry it for years, sometimes as long as 20, before the first visible sign ever showed up on the skin. And only about 1 in 10 of the people exposed to it actually developed the disease at all. So you have this long, invisible, patient process, this thing quietly taking root in the cooler parts of the body, the skin near the surface, the nerves in the hands and feet and face, all while the person goes about their life, marries, works, raises children, with no idea that anything is wrong. After all that waiting, it begins to surface. The early signs were easy to miss, or easy to mistake for something harmless. A stuffy nose that wouldn't clear up, a little unexplained bleeding, pale patches on the skin, or reddish ones that didn't feel quite normal when you touched them. What set leprosy apart from nearly everything else we're going to talk about today was simple. It went for the nerves. It killed sensation. Once those nerves near the surface of the body died off, the affected parts went numb, and a numb body is a body that has lost its ability to protect itself. Think about everything your sense of pain quietly does for you in a single ordinary day, all the work it does that you never once notice. It snatches your hand off a hot pot before you've even decided to move. It tells you the inside of your shoe is rubbing your heel raw. It stops you leaning your bare arm on a sharp edge. It makes you shift your weight off a sore spot before that sore spot becomes a real injury. Every minute of every day, your body is sending you 1,000 tiny warnings and corrections, and you obey them without thinking. Now take all of that away. A person with advanced leprosy is walking through the world with all those warnings switched off. So they start accumulating damage they never feel arriving. A leper could burn their fingers in a cooking fire and only realize it later, from the smell, from the look of the skin. They could wear a hole clean through the sole of their foot, walking on it wrong for weeks, without ever once feeling the warning that should have told them to stop. Small injuries that you or I would notice and protect turned into deep, open ulcers, because nothing inside told the body that anything was wrong. Infection set in again and again. And over time, the body, between the constant infections and the disease itself slowly reabsorbing the bone, would shorten the fingers and the toes, joint by joint, year by year. That's where the old image comes from, the one where you picture pieces of a leper just dropping off onto the ground. The truth is slower and a great deal sadder than that horror story version. Repeated unfelt injury, repeated infection, and the body quietly eating its own bone from the inside, so that hands curled inward into claws and grew shorter, and feet did the same, until a person who had once been whole was reduced, a little at a time, from the fingertips inward. The mechanism was gradual and almost gentle in its slowness, but the result, seen from across a street, looked exactly like a human being, slowly being erased from the edges. And it changed how a person could live and work in 100 small ways that added up to something total. A craftsman who needed his hands, a weaver, a smith, a farmer, lost his trade as his fingers went, not because his strength failed all at once, but because he could no longer feel the tools in his grip, could no longer tell how hard he was holding something, kept injuring himself on the work without knowing. A person who walked everywhere, as nearly everyone did, found walking turning dangerous, every unfelt stone in the road another wound waiting to happen. The disease didn't just disfigure, it dismantled a person's entire ability to make a living, to feed themselves, to do the ordinary things that filled a life. And it did it so slowly that there was time to grieve each loss as it came. Then there was the face, the part that did the most to make leprosy the thing it became in the medieval imagination. In the more severe form, the form where the bacteria spread widely through all the cooler tissues, the face itself began to change. The skin grew coarse and thick and lumpy. Deep folds appeared across the forehead. The nose broadened and spread and distorted. The earlobes thickened and hung. The eyebrows and the eyelashes fell out, leaving the face strangely bare. Physicians eventually gave this transformation a name, the lion face, because of that heavy, swollen, furrowed look it produced. A face that had stopped looking entirely human and started looking like something else. The cartilage inside the nose was destroyed by the disease, so the bridge collapsed inward and the whole center of the face sank. And because leprosy so often took the nerves that let a person blink, and the nerves that let them feel their own eyes, the eyes dried out, scarred over, and in a real portion of cases went blind. More than 70% of patients had some involvement of the eyes. A meaningful number of them lost their sight completely, on top of everything else the disease was doing to them. Let me just say plainly what the advanced disease meant for a person, without dressing it up. A person in the late stages had lost the feeling in their hands and feet. They had lost fingers and toes. They had a face that no longer resembled the face they'd been born with, sunken and lion-like and bare. They might well be going blind, and in a huge number of cases, they were still completely lucid, still entirely themselves on the inside, still aware of every single thing that was happening to them, still able to remember what they used to look like, still able to grieve it. That's the part that's hard to sit with. The mind stayed clear and present while the body became a stranger the person was trapped inside. I should be honest with you about the word itself because the medieval sources are notoriously slippery here, and I'd rather tell you that than pretend the records are cleaner than they are. Medieval people used the word leprosy for a whole grab bag of skin conditions: psoriasis, eczema, severe cases of other infections. Sometimes things we'd now recognize as entirely separate diseases, all of it could get swept under the same terrifying label. One historian put it about as plainly as it can be put, that for practical purposes, a medieval leper was simply whoever got called a leper and was treated as one. So we have to be a little careful, but the skeletons keep it from being just a story about misdiagnosis. When archaeologists dig up the cemeteries attached to the houses where lepers were sent to live and die, the majority of the skeletons do show the real disease, the genuine bone changes of advanced leprosy. So the fear, however muddled it got, wasn't built on nothing. The actual disease was real, and it was living among them. What did they think caused it? A bit of everything, honestly, because medieval medicine was a magpie that picked up shiny ideas from everywhere. Some thought you caught it through ordinary contact, some thought it came through sex. Theories involving venomous worms circulated, along with theories about eating spoiled fish and theories about breathing bad air. But underneath all the medical guesswork sat a much heavier belief, and that belief shaped absolutely everything about how lepers were treated. They thought it was a punishment, a visible mark stamped on the body by God Himself, a sign of sin, and especially the sins of the flesh, lust and pride and greed. The Book of Kings had a story about a servant named Gehazi who was struck with leprosy as punishment for his greed and his lying, and that one story did an enormous amount of work in the medieval mind. If your body was visibly rotting, the logic went, then surely your soul had rotted first, and the rot was just working its way to the surface for everyone to see. And yet they carried a strange double feeling about it, because medieval Christianity almost never did anything in a simple, single-minded way. At the very same time as they treated lepers as cursed and unclean, they also half believed that lepers were, in some way, blessed. The reasoning went like this: a person suffering this much, enduring what looked like purgatory while they were still alive and breathing, might be paying off the debt of their sins right here on earth, and might therefore be heading straight to heaven when they died. Some truly holy figures sought lepers out on purpose, washed them, kissed their sores, tended them as an act of devotion, precisely because there was something Christ-like seen in their suffering. So a leper could be, in the very same breath, the most unclean person in a town and also the one standing closest to God. People didn't seem to find that contradiction nearly as unbearable as we might. Both things could be true at the same time. And the leper had to live inside both of them at once, cursed and holy, exiled and somehow sacred. Sit for a moment with how strange that must have been to live inside. A person whose own neighbors crossed the street to avoid them, who could not enter the church with everyone else, who carried a clapper to warn the healthy away, was at the very same time being told by that same religion that their agony might be making them holy, that they were perhaps closer to salvation than the people doing the shunning. Some lepers seem to have taken real comfort in that, leaning into the idea that the suffering had a purpose, that the slow ruin of the body was somehow buying the freedom of the soul. Others surely found it a thin and bitter comfort, a story told to people who had already lost everything, to make the losing a little easier to swallow. The records rarely let us hear which way any one leper actually felt about it. But the framework was there, woven right into the culture, holding out to the afflicted both the worst and the best things a person can be told about themselves, and often from the very same mouth, in the very same breath. As for what the physicians actually did once a person was sick, the honest answer is that they did very little that helped, and some of it made things worse. They bled people, because bleeding was the answer to nearly everything in the medieval physician's mind, the great corrective for an imbalance of the humours. They prescribed special diets, advised against certain foods thought to feed the disease, and recommended baths. Ointments were applied, and stranger remedies still were tried, including, in some texts, the blood of various animals and preparations that strike us now as closer to magic than medicine. None of it touched the bacterium. None of it could. The most useful thing a physician could realistically offer a leper was an accurate diagnosis, and even that, as we've seen, was a kind of sentence rather than a help. The disease ran its long course no matter what anyone smeared on it or drained out of the patient. So the leper houses were never really places of cure. They were places of waiting and of prayer and of being kept apart. And the prayer was, in its way, the most honest treatment on offer, because at least it didn't pretend the body could be saved. When somebody fell under suspicion, there was usually a process to it. Communities set up little panels to make the call. A priest, sometimes a physician, and sometimes other lepers, who knew the signs better than anyone because they were living them. And the decision carried enormous weight because a confirmed diagnosis didn't simply mean you'd get medical care. It meant the end of your old life, completely and permanently. So in serious cases, especially when the person was someone important, the examiners actually held off. They waited. In one famous case, the physicians of a royal court deliberately delayed naming the disease in a young heir, watching for further signs, because they understood that the moment somebody said the word out loud, the person's entire future would change shape. A kindness was buried in that hesitation, and also a kind of dread. What changed, when the word was finally said, was this. The leper went through a ritual that declared them dead, not metaphorically dead, in the eyes of the law and the church, actually dead. Sometimes the ritual was acted out as a literal funeral for a person who was still standing there breathing. The roots of it went back centuries to old Germanic laws that described a leper as being like a dead man, a person whose property could be inherited by their heirs as though they'd already gone into the ground. By the high medieval period, this had hardened into full ceremony, with a name, the separation of the leper. The afflicted person would be brought to a church. In some versions, they were made to kneel beneath a black cloth, the way a body might lie beneath a pall at a real funeral mass. In some accounts, they were led out to a grave, an actual open grave dug into the churchyard, and made to stand down in it while the priest threw earth over them. The accounts vary on how far this went, from a full symbolic burial up to the neck, to just a ceremonial shovelful of dirt cast over the feet. But the meaning was identical, no matter the version. You are entering the ground now. You are leaving the world of the living, and you are not coming back to it. Then the priest read out the rules, and the rules are devastating in how specific they are, because what they describe is a human being carved out of ordinary life, one small ordinary thing at a time. You may not enter a church. You may not enter a mill or a bakehouse or a marketplace or any gathering where people come together. You may not wash your hands or your belongings in any stream or spring or fountain that other people use. You may not drink from a public well. If you want to buy something, you are not permitted to touch it. You must point at it instead and let the seller handle it. You may not walk down narrow lanes where you would be forced to pass close to another person. You may not touch children. You may not eat or drink in company, except in the company of other lepers. And you may not lie with anyone but your own husband or wife. One version of the rite said it about as starkly as it has ever been said, that the leper must from now on consider themselves dead to the world and separate from the living, their life now belonging to God and set apart from the company of other people. Read that list again slowly sometime and notice what it actually strips away. Not just the grand things, the small, daily human ones, handing over a coin and taking the warm loaf into your own hands, cupping water from a cold stream on a hot day, taking the shortest path home through the close little lanes of a medieval town, standing near enough to your own child to feel them lean their weight against your leg, all of it gone by formal decree, sealed with a shovel of dirt and a few sentences of Latin. The disease took your fingers slowly over years. The ceremony took everything else in a single afternoon. Then they handed you an instrument, a bell or a wooden clapper or a rattle, and you were required to sound it whenever you came near other people. In some places it was called a Lazarus bell. The clapper was a set of wooden paddles fixed to a handle, and when you shook it, it made a flat, hollow, knocking sound that carried down the road ahead of you. It served two purposes at the same time, and the two purposes sit very uneasily together. It warned healthy people to keep their distance and clear the way, and it also announced to anyone feeling charitable that here came a person who needed alms. So the sound of an approaching leper was, all at once, a warning and a plea, a noise that said, "Stay away from me, and please help me," in the very same breath, over and over, every time the person had to move through the world. Lepers often wore distinctive clothing as well. In some places, a marker stitched onto the chest, and when they were allowed near a church at all, they watched the service through a narrow slit cut into the wall, a leper's window, so they could see the altar and the host raised without ever setting foot inside the building with everyone else. The places they were sent had a name: leper houses, lazar houses, leprosaria, and these places are worth a closer look because they were among the very first hospitals in all of Europe built for a single disease. They had their own chapels, their own graveyards, their own priests, and they ran on monastic lines with rules and daily routines and hours of prayer. One detail people consistently get wrong is this: they weren't always tucked away out of sight in some distant wilderness. A great many of them were deliberately built right on the main roads, at the crossroads, exactly where the traffic passed, precisely because the residents depended on the arms of travelers to survive. The living dead were placed where the living would have to see them, and, with luck, where the living would give. Wealthy patrons funded these houses. A king of England was a steady, reliable supporter of one. And there was even a grim little class system operating inside the walls, where a wealthier leper could buy himself a more comfortable private cell, and even bring along a servant to look after him, while the poor crowded together in the common hall and made do. Life inside one of these houses ran to a strict rhythm because they were modeled on monasteries, and the people who founded them firmly believed that order and prayer were good for the soul, even if they could do nothing for the body. The residents rose for prayer, ate at set times, often had rules about what they could wear and how they should behave, and were expected to live almost like monks and nuns, with a daily round of religious devotion structuring the hours. For some, that structure must have been a mercy of its own kind, a way of belonging to something again after being cast out of everything they'd known, a community of people in the same condition who understood exactly what each other was living through. For others, it must have felt like a prison with a chapel attached. The houses controlled the residents' contact with the outside world, decided who could come and go, managed the alms that came in. A leper who had been a free person with a trade and a family and a place in a village now lived under rules again, fed and housed but supervised, kept apart, his old life formally ended and this strange half-life put in its place. And when he died, he was buried in the house's own graveyard, in ground set aside for lepers, apart even in death from the people he had once lived among. These houses existed in great numbers. One famously prolific English chronicler put the count across the whole of Europe at something like 19,000, with a couple of thousand in France alone. England by itself had at least 320 leper houses founded over a few centuries, and the very earliest known English example held remains that have been dated back to 1,000 years ago and more. So this was no late development, it was woven deep into the period. Now, I'd hold that figure of 19,000 fairly loosely, because medieval chroniclers were not exactly rigorous with their big round numbers, and a number like that has a whiff of the symbolic about it. But even if you cut it down hard, the scale of the thing was still enormous. This was an entire parallel system, an infrastructure of exclusion and of care, two things you would think could never sit together, existing side by side across a continent. The church itself wrestled with how to handle these people, and a great council in the 12th century formally addressed their situation, affirming that lepers had the right to their own churches, their own priests, and their own burial grounds, since they couldn't share in those of the healthy. So even the formal machinery of the church was built around the assumption that these were people who had been permanently set apart, given a shadow version of ordinary religious life to live out at a distance. A military religious order was even born out of it, the Order of St. Lazarus, which began as a leper hospital just outside the walls of Jerusalem, and whose early members were leper knights. Leper knights, men who had been warriors, who then contracted the disease, and who went on fighting under a banner that took its name from Lazarus the beggar in the parable, the very same root that gives us the word Lazar house. A knight with his hands already going, his face already changing, still strapping on what armor he could and riding out. They existed. The disease reached every level of society, and one of the best documented sufferers happened to be a king, the only reason we know his case in such detail. A young ruler of Jerusalem in the 12th century was diagnosed as a boy, when a tutor noticed he felt no pain when other children dug their nails into his arm. They crowned him anyway, around the age of 13, and he ruled for roughly a decade as the disease took him apart, winning a famous battle as a teenager, then gradually losing the use of a hand, then his sight, until he had to be carried into his own campaigns on a litter and have his hand guided to seal his own decrees. He died in his early 20s. What his case shows, more than anything, is that the disease made no exceptions. It did to a crowned king exactly what it did to a beggar at the city gate. The same numbness, the same slow ruin of the hands and the face and the eyes, just better recorded because of who he was. For every leper whose decline got written down, there were thousands whose identical suffering left no trace at all. And it's those thousands the disease really belonged to. The ordinary person who started losing feeling in a hand and knew, with rising dread, exactly what it might mean. Because everyone in a medieval town knew what leprosy looked like and what happened to the people who got it. A stretch of time would follow, maybe a long one, where a person noticed the early signs and told no one, hiding the numb patch, keeping gloves on, avoiding the examiners because to be named was to lose everything. People did exactly that, concealed it as long as they could, kept working and living among their families, terrified of the day someone would notice. And the families often knew too, and kept the secret alongside them, because the alternative was watching someone they loved be declared dead and led away. The fear ran deep enough that it could turn ugly fast. In hard years, in times of plague or famine or political panic, lepers were sometimes accused of monstrous things, of poisoning wells, of plotting against the healthy, of conspiring with outsiders to spread the disease deliberately. Whole episodes are recorded where lepers were rounded up and punished on the strength of rumors like that, scapegoated for disasters they had nothing to do with, simply because they were already the most feared and the most powerless people around. A group that had already lost their place in society, already been declared dead and set apart, made an easy target when a frightened population went looking for someone to blame. The disease took their bodies, and the fear of the disease, in the worst moments, took whatever safety they had left. Leprosy faded out of Europe after the 14th century or so, and the honest answer is that nobody is entirely certain why. People have put forward all sorts of explanations. The strict isolation may genuinely have worked to some degree, slowing the spread. The Black Death and the other fast, savage killers may have swept away the lepers right along with everyone else, since a person already weakened by one disease tends not to survive a second catastrophe arriving on top of it. Diet may have changed, along with housing and the clothing people wore. There's a long-running idea that the rise of tuberculosis actually killed off a lot of leprosy sufferers and gave a kind of cross-protection to the survivors, though the more recent research suggests the truth is messier than any single clean explanation like that. Most likely it was several different things at once, working in different regions at different times, for different reasons. The disease itself never fully left the world, but the leper standing at the crossroads with his clapper, his face changed, his hands gone, that particular figure that every European once knew on sight, slowly stopped being part of the everyday landscape. As the disease retreated, the great network of leper houses was left half empty, with chapels and graveyards and cells built for a population that was no longer arriving. Many of the houses were quietly repurposed, turned into ordinary hospitals, almshouses for the poor, or simply allowed to fall into ruin, their endowments redirected to other uses. The clappers and the bells fell silent. The rituals that had once declared the living dead stopped being performed because there was no longer a steady stream of people to perform them on. It's a strange thing to think about, an entire elaborate machinery of fear and exclusion built up over centuries, slowly winding down, not because anyone decided to be kinder, but because the thing it had been built to handle was simply, for reasons no one fully understood, going away. The fear outlived the disease for a while, the way fear tends to, but eventually even that faded, and the leper houses became just old buildings with odd names, their original purpose half forgotten by the people who walked past them. Tuberculosis, on the other hand, never had the decency to fade. If leprosy was the disease that took you apart from the outside, where everyone could watch it happening, tuberculosis was the one that hollowed you out quietly from within, so slowly and so privately that for centuries people half romanticized it, even as it killed more of them than almost anything else on this list. It was so common, so woven into ordinary life, that it barely registered as a distinct catastrophe at all. It was simply there, in every town and every village, taking a steady toll year after year, a background hum of death that everyone lived alongside. People didn't flee from it the way they fled from a leper or barricaded their doors against a plague. Partly because it moved too slowly to feel like an emergency, and partly because it was everywhere, so there was nowhere to flee to. You couldn't outrun something that was already in your own household, already in your own lungs, waiting. They called it consumption, and that word is doing precisely what it sounds like it's doing. The disease consumed you. It ate you from the inside while you watched it happen. A person with consumption grew thinner and thinner and paler and more tired until they seemed to be made of less and less of themselves with each passing month. The Greeks had their own word for it too, phthisis, from a verb meaning to waste away, and they had noticed the very same brutal pattern thousands of years before the medieval world ever did. It struck the young with particular cruelty, people in the absolute prime of their lives, 18, 20, 30 years old. The age when a person is supposed to be at their strongest and most full of life, and instead they simply faded out, day by day, in front of everyone who loved them. What it actually did inside the lungs was relentless and patient. A chronic cough that would not stop, that went on for weeks and then months. Then the cough began to bring up blood, just flecks at first. Little spots of bright red against a handkerchief, and sometimes a great deal worse later on. Chest pain, a fever that came and went, burning and then receding, and the night sweats, drenching, soaking sweats, where the person woke in the dark with the bedding wet through, the fever burning itself off while they slept and leaving them shivering and exhausted in the cold damp of their own sheets. They lost their appetite entirely. They lost weight they couldn't afford to lose, the flesh melting off the bones. And all of this went on for months, sometimes for years, a long, slow decline with false recoveries folded into it, little merciful stretches where the person seemed to rally and get better, and everyone around them let themselves hope, before the slide quietly resumed. At the very end, it was, in the plainest terms, a slow suffocation, the lungs too ruined and scarred to do the one job they had left. Hippocrates himself, centuries before any of this, had called it the most widespread disease of his own time, and had noted that it was almost always fatal, and that it fell most heavily on people between roughly 18 and 35, meaning on exactly the people a community could least afford to lose, the young parents, the workers, the ones who were supposed to be burying the old rather than being buried by them. That pattern held all the way through the medieval centuries. A household would watch its strongest young adult fade over a year or two, helpless to stop it. And there was a peculiar cruelty in the slowness of it, in the way the disease left the mind perfectly clear right up until near the end. The consumptive often knew exactly what was happening to them, could feel themselves growing lighter and weaker, could see the fear in the faces of the people sitting with them, and had a great deal of time to think about all of it. A fast death is its own horror, but a slow one, with full awareness, watching everyone you love watch you go, is a different kind of weight entirely. The great physician Galen, whose ideas hung over all of medieval medicine like a low ceiling that nobody could see past, had looked inside diseased lungs himself and found the little hard lumps, the tubercles that would one day give the disease its modern name, and he had warned, correctly, that the disease could pass from one person to another. Through all the medieval centuries, it kept its old inherited names, consumption and phthisis, and it kept doing exactly what it had always done, which was to take people gradually, in their own beds, surrounded by family who could do absolutely nothing useful except sit with them, wipe the sweat from their faces and empty the basin. No cure existed, barely even a treatment worth the name existed, just the watching and the waiting and the slow disappearing of someone you loved. People tried what they could, of course, because doing nothing for a dying relative is more than most can bear. They moved the sick to warmer or drier air when they could afford to, on the reasonable instinct that climate seemed to matter. They fed them rich, fattening foods to try to put back the weight the disease kept stripping away, milk and eggs and broth, a losing battle against a body that wouldn't hold on to anything. They tried syrups for the cough, herbs of every description, bleeding, the same humoral remedies applied to everything. Some of it might have brought a little comfort. None of it stopped the disease. And there was a quiet confusion running underneath it all, because even though careful observers from Galen onward suspected the illness could pass between people, in practice, families stayed close to the sick, sharing the same rooms, the same beds, the same air, nursing them to the end. So the disease spread the way it always had. Household to household, often taking several members of the same family one after another over the years, each one watching the last go and perhaps already carrying it themselves. But tuberculosis had a second form, one that didn't go for the lungs at all, and this one connects to one of the strangest and most theatrical rituals in all of medieval kingship. When the bacteria settled instead into the lymph nodes of the neck, they produced a condition called scrofula, and scrofula was visible, out in the open, in a way the lung disease never was. It began as swellings in the neck, lumps, often painless at first, sitting there under the skin. They grew. The skin stretched tight over them, and then it broke, and what had been a swelling became an open, weeping, draining sore that would not close, leaking fluid, foul-smelling, sitting there on a person's neck for the entire world to see and recoil from. The name scrofula itself comes from a word for a young sow, a brood pig, either because pigs were thought to suffer from something like it, or because a row of those swollen nodes running along the side of the neck looked a little like a sow's swollen underside. It is not a flattering comparison, and the people who carried the disease knew exactly how they looked to everyone who passed them. One quality of scrofula made it different from everything else and turned it into the stuff of royal legend. It rarely actually killed you, and it very often got better on its own, the swellings receding, the sores eventually closing over, sometimes for no reason that anyone could see or explain. A disease that disfigures you horribly and frightens everyone around you, and then sometimes simply vanishes on its own, is just about the perfect raw material for a miracle. And the kings of medieval England and France understood that perfectly, so they touched people. The kings themselves, and in England sometimes the queens who ruled in their own right, claimed that God had granted them, and them alone, the power to cure scrofula simply by laying their hands upon the sufferer. The disease even picked up a second name out of the whole business, the king's evil, an evil that only the touch of a king could drive out of the body. In England, the story reaches back at least to Edward the Confessor, before the Norman conquest, who supposedly cured a woman of the swellings in her neck by touching her, and the story goes that he ordered the people he touched to be looked after at his own expense until they recovered. In France, they traced the gift back to their own sainted king, the very same Louis we are going to meet again later, dying in a North African camp before this is over. And the practice was not some small, occasional thing. One English king is recorded as having touched well over 500 people in a single month, and more than 1,000 across a single year. They would line up, the afflicted, with their swollen necks and their weeping open sores, sometimes for hours, and the king would move down the line, laying his hands on each of them and making the sign of the cross over them. And a contemporary eyewitness to one French king described the crowds of sufferers physically pressing in around him, desperate to be touched, and sit with what that ceremony actually was for a moment, from both sides of it. For the sick person, it might be the only hope they had been offered in their whole life, a journey of days to reach the king, a long wait in a press of other desperate bodies, all of them with the same ruined necks, and then the brief, almost unbearable moment when the most powerful man in the kingdom reached out and laid his bare hands directly on your open sores, the thing that everyone else in your life had been recoiling from. And for the king, it was a performance of his own holiness, his own God-given right to rule, carried out by touching the untouchable in front of witnesses, demonstrating that he was so favored by heaven that the king's evil itself fled from his hands. Two very different needs met in the same gesture, the sick reaching for a cure and the crown reaching for legitimacy, both of them depending on a disease that mostly cured itself anyway. Eventually, the ceremony came with a gift attached to it. The king would hang a gold coin around the neck of each person he had touched, a coin pierced through and strung on a ribbon, to be worn like a protective charm for the rest of the person's life. The coin had the image of Saint Michael on it, driving his spear into the dragon. People kept these touch pieces and treasured them. The quiet engine that kept the whole thing running was simple. Because scrofula so often faded away on its own, every single time someone happened to get better after being touched by the king, it looked like proof. Proof that the favor of God really did flow down through the royal hand and into the sick. Which was, for a king, an extraordinarily useful thing to be able to demonstrate to your subjects, especially if you happen to be a king whose claim to the throne was a little bit shaky, a usurper, or the founder of a new line who needed God to publicly take his side. The disease that healed itself quietly became the disease that loudly proved you were meant to rule. And the sick people standing patiently in that line with their ruined necks were, without ever knowing it, performing the legitimacy of the entire monarchy with their own bodies. Medieval medicine had nothing real to offer for either form of tuberculosis. They didn't know about the bacterium, and they wouldn't for centuries. So they reached for what they had, which was the same toolkit they reached for with everything. Humoral theory, the idea that the body was governed by 4 fluids that all had to be kept in careful balance, and the treatments that flowed from it, bleeding the patient, adjusting the diet, this or that herbal preparation, visits to the tombs of saints, the holy coins and the protective charms. None of it touched the actual disease in any way. Consumption simply kept on consuming. And it would go on doing exactly that, century after century after century, long past the end of the medieval world, killing quietly in bedrooms while the louder, more dramatic diseases got all the attention and all the fear. Speaking of louder diseases, let me take you over to Italy now, to the very tail end of the medieval period and the first uneasy years of whatever you want to call what came after it, because something arrived in Italy in the 1490s that horrified people who genuinely believed they had already seen the very worst the world had to throw at a human body. In the summer of 1494, the King of France marched an army down into Italy to make good on a claim to the Kingdom of Naples. It was a large force, tens of thousands of men, and the great majority of them were mercenaries, hired soldiers gathered from all over the continent, Swiss and German and Spanish and Italian and more, the usual mixed and rootless crowd that always followed the money to wherever a war was being fought. And following along behind the army, as armies have always been followed throughout all of human history, came the camp followers, including a number of women who sold sex to the soldiers to survive. The army reached Naples in the early part of 1495, held the place for a few months, and then, as the whole campaign began to fall apart, the king disbanded his forces and sent them home. And the mercenaries scattered back toward every corner of Europe they had come from. They carried something home with them. Within just a few years, it had reached France, Germany, Switzerland, the Low Countries, England, Scotland, Hungary, and Russia, and within a single decade, it had traveled along the trade routes as far as India and even China. A brand new disease, or at the very least a disease in a form that nobody alive had ever seen before, and it moved through the population like fire through a dry field, because not one single person on the continent had any resistance to it whatsoever. The earliest descriptions we have come from the military surgeons who saw it first in the troops. It often began modestly, almost innocently, with a sore on the genitals that didn't even hurt very much. From there it bloomed into something out of a nightmare, pustules and sores erupting across the face and then across the entire body, foul-smelling abscesses opening up everywhere. And the descriptions that survive from the time are genuinely difficult to read, because this early version of the disease was vastly more violent and more grotesque than the slow chronic illness the very same disease would eventually settle down into. One careful summary of the contemporary accounts says that the pustules could cover the body from the top of the head all the way down to the knees, that the disease caused the flesh to fall away from people's faces, and that it killed within just a few months of the first sore appearing. The bones ached, a deep, boring, gnawing pain in the bones themselves, and it was always worst at night, so that sleep, the one small mercy a sick person might hope for at the end of a terrible day, was exactly the time when the agony rose to its peak. The disease ate into the roof of the mouth and into the nose, destroying the palate, collapsing the features of the face inward. People's faces, in the most literal sense, came apart while they were still living behind them. A German scholar who caught the disease himself around the year 1501 wrote about it afterward, and he did not reach for delicate or careful language. He called it so cruel, so distressing, and so appalling that nothing more terrible or more disgusting had ever before been known anywhere on the earth. He described 1,000 abscesses clustered around his own genitals and the agony of the mercury treatment he then had to endure. Another man, a humanist scholar who suffered with the disease for years and eventually wrote an entire treatise about his own body and what was happening to it, described his pustules as standing out from his skin like acorns and oozing a matter so foul and so stinking that anyone who came within range of the smell genuinely believed they had caught the disease themselves just from breathing the same air. These are not distant, detached clinical observers describing strangers. These are men describing their own bodies in their own words, trying with everything they had to make the rest of the world understand what was actually happening to them. Nobody wanted to own it, so everybody named it after somebody else, and the naming turned into its own little war between nations. To the Italians and the Germans and the English, it was the French disease, the French pox. To the French, naturally, it was nothing of the sort. It was the disease of Naples, the Neapolitan sickness, something those Italians had given them. The Scots had their own grim word for it. The Russians called it the Polish disease, and the Poles, refusing to accept the blame, passed it further along to the east. It was, depending entirely on where you happened to be standing, always somebody else's fault, always the filth of the foreigners next door. The French also gave it the name the Great Pox, specifically to set it apart from smallpox, and that distinction is going to matter, so hang on to it, because smallpox is coming up shortly. A polite, mannered name for it even circulated at court. The disease of palaces, the malady of the magnates, because it spread very happily indeed among the very same powerful people who liked to pretend they were far too refined to suffer from anything so vulgar. What unsettled people most, beyond the horror of the symptoms, was the speed and the strangeness of it. To the people living through the 1490s, this looked like a brand new affliction, something that had simply never existed before, appearing out of nowhere and racing across the whole known world in a matter of years. That was frightening in a way that's easy to underestimate now. The old diseases, however terrible, were at least familiar, woven into the expected shape of life and death. This was something the ancient authorities, the great physicians everyone trusted, had never written a word about, because it hadn't been there to write about. Cities began passing rules to deal with it. Some moved to expel the infected, or to shut them away, or to regulate the brothels where it was understood to spread. Hospitals were founded specifically for its sufferers, places where people whose faces and bodies were coming apart could at least be housed and tended, often by religious orders, since the disease left so many of its victims too disfigured and too poor to fend for themselves. And because it carried such an obvious mark of shame, tangled up with sex and sin in everyone's mind, the people who had it often faced not just the agony of the disease, but the judgment of everyone around them, blamed for their own suffering, treated as having earned it. The same pattern we saw with leprosy played out all over again, the sick body read as proof of a corrupt soul, the suffering taken as a verdict. Now the treatments. And this is where the whole story manages to get, if anything, even grimmer, because what they did to people in the name of curing it could be considerably worse than the disease itself. The two main options were a special wood imported all the way from the New World, brewed up into a bitter drink, and mercury. Mercury was the big one, the one everybody remembers. They rubbed it into the skin as an ointment. They gave it by mouth as pills. And most dramatically of all, they fumigated people with it, sealing the patient inside a hot, closed wooden box or a small sealed room and filling the space with mercury vapor for days at a time, sometimes for weeks on end. Mercury makes a person salivate enormously and sweat very heavily. and the physicians took that flood of drool and sweat as clear proof that the poison was being successfully driven out of the body. In reality, it was mercury poisoning, layered on top of the original disease, the body desperately trying to flush out a metal it had no way to expel. The side effects were savage. The inside of the mouth ulcerated and came apart. The teeth loosened and fell out. The patient drooled uncontrollably, became dangerously dehydrated, shook with tremors, suffered damage to the nerves and the kidneys, and in a great many cases the treatment itself did the killing that the disease hadn't yet gotten around to. The grim little proverb that came out of the whole miserable business was that one night with Venus led to a lifetime with Mercury. A single encounter, and then potentially years of being slowly poisoned in a sweatbox in the name of being cured. Spend a moment inside that sweatbox, because it's a particular kind of misery that's easy to skate past. A person already suffering from a disease that covered them in oozing sores and ached in their bones at night was now also shut inside a hot, sealed, airless space, breathing poison vapor for days. The mouth filling with sores and the teeth going loose. Pints of saliva pouring out day after day, the body desperately trying to flush out a metal it couldn't get rid of. The trembling hands, and the whole time, the patient and the physician both reading these signs of poisoning as encouragement, as evidence the cure was taking hold, which meant the worse you felt, the more they pressed on. People went through this repeatedly, course after course, because the disease kept coming back. It's one of the bleaker corners of the whole history, a treatment that mimicked progress by making the patient sicker, embraced precisely because it produced such dramatic and visible effects. The name we still use today, syphilis, came from a poem of all the unlikely places. In 1530, an Italian physician, who was also a poet and an astronomer, published an epic poem about a shepherd named Syphilis, who was cursed with the disease by the sun god, and somehow the name of that fictional shepherd peeled off the page and attached itself permanently to the disease itself. The same man coined the lasting term we still use for some of its later lesions, those soft, resin-like growths that appeared in the disease's later stages. He also wrote about the disease with a clarity that was ahead of his time, describing how it spread and how it ran its course. So the disease that rotted the faces off of living people got its enduring name from a piece of gentle pastoral poetry about a shepherd. The medieval and early modern world was absolutely full of these strange juxtapositions. Beauty and horror handed the very same pen and told to get to work. And the disease itself was changing, even in those first few decades, and that's part of why the early descriptions read so much more like a horror story than the chronic illness people would later come to know. A disease that has just jumped into a population with no resistance to it tends to be at its most savage, killing fast and visibly, and then, over the generations, it often settles into something slower and less immediately lethal, because a disease that kills its host too quickly burns out its own chances to spread. By around the middle of the 16th century, only a few decades after that first explosion at Naples, the disease had already largely shifted into the slower, more chronic form that we would recognize, the form that does its damage over years and decades rather than over a few horrifying months. So the people who caught it in 1495 caught something distinctly worse in its raw, immediate cruelty than what came after. They were at the front edge of it, taking the full force of a disease that hadn't yet learned to take its time. Where did it actually come from, though? And this is a real, live, unsettled argument among serious people, so I'll lay it out honestly for you, rather than pretending it's been neatly solved. There's the idea that the cruise of Columbus brought it back home from the Americas in 1493, which lines up rather suspiciously well with that explosive outbreak in Italy in 1495. There's the competing idea that a related disease was already quietly lurking in the Old World long before that, often misidentified as leprosy or as something else. And there's a third idea that all of these related diseases are really just one single disease wearing different clothes in different climates. The genetic detective work has swung back and forth over the years. Older studies tended to point toward a New World origin. More recent ancient DNA work, including some very recent findings indeed, has tilted things back toward the diseases having deep, ancient roots in the Americas, while still leaving wide open the specific question of whether the venereal, sexually transmitted form of the disease existed in Europe before 1493 or not. So I'll just leave it where the actual evidence leaves it, genuinely contested, with intelligent and careful people still disagreeing in good faith. What is not in any dispute at all is what the disease did to the bodies of the people who caught it in those first few terrible years, and that part needs no debate. Now I want to come back down from the level of kings and continents and famous physicians, because there's a disease on this list that did not care in the slightest whether you were a beggar in a ditch or a crowned monarch, and it killed more of both than any battle in the entire medieval period ever managed. It simply doesn't get the attention it earned because it's undignified, and history has always been a little squeamish about the precise way it ends a person. The bloody flux, dysentery. The word itself sounds almost too clean and clinical for what the thing actually was. A person with dysentery had diarrhea, but that word doesn't begin to carry the weight of it, because this was bloody and full of mucus, and it came with cramps so severe that they doubled grown people over and left them gasping, and on top of that, a constant, agonizing, completely useless urge to keep going, even when there was nothing left inside to pass, a straining that the physicians of the day had their own name for. In the very worst cases, a person could lose more than a full liter of fluid in a single hour, the body emptying itself out faster than anyone could possibly pour it back in. An old medical description of how the stools changed as the disease advanced, reached for words like rotten and insufferably offensive, and spoke of an atrocious, unrelenting pain. The smell of it filled rooms, filled tents, filled whole encampments, and there was no escaping it. Death usually followed. You died of the dehydration, of the steady blood loss, of the infection finally breaking out of the gut and getting into the rest of the body, poisoning the blood, reaching the liver or the lungs and shutting them down. It was a degrading way to die, because there's a particular and specific cruelty in a death that strips away every last shred of a person's dignity in their final days, that leaves them soiled and cramping and ashamed and helpless in front of the very people who are trying to care for them. Kings died this way. Saints died this way. and the ordinary soldier in the ditch died this way in numbers that are genuinely staggering once you actually start looking for them in the records. What made it so relentless was the way it fed on itself. A person sick with the flux is losing fluid faster than they can take it in, growing weaker by the hour, and the more dehydrated they get, the worse everything else becomes. They're desperately thirsty, so they drink, and if the only water available is the same contaminated water that's already moving through the whole camp, they're just taking in more of the thing that's killing them with every cup. The sick fouled the ground and the fouled water made more people sick, and the cycle simply turned and turned. In a crowded camp or a besieged town, there was often no way out of that loop at all. You couldn't leave, you couldn't get clean water, you couldn't isolate the sick because there were too many of them, and nobody understood that isolating them would even help. You just watched it spread, tent to tent, house to house, knowing more would fall ill tomorrow and having no idea how to stop it. Dysentery was the great killer of medieval armies, and above all of sieges, so reliably and so predictably that it earned itself the nickname, the siege disease. The reason behind it is grim and embarrassingly simple. A siege meant that you took thousands of men, plus all their horses and pack animals, and you parked the entire mass of them in one fixed place for weeks or even months at a stretch, all of them eating, all of them producing waste, all of them drinking from water that was getting more thoroughly contaminated with every single day that passed, with no real sanitation, no proper latrines, and no understanding whatsoever of why people kept falling sick and dying. It was a nearly perfect machine for breeding and spreading a disease that travels through human filth. And over and over and over again, across the whole period, more soldiers died of the flux in their own camps than ever died with a weapon in their hands on the field. When the English king Henry V laid siege to the town of Harfleur in 1415, before the famous battle that everybody learns about in school, he lost thousands of his men, and the great killer that emptied his camp was dysentery rather than any French arrow or sword. Something like a third of his entire army was gone before they ever reached the famous battlefield, either dead in the mud or invalided home in disgrace, their own bowels having accomplished what the enemy could not. And that, of course, is precisely the part that the heroic, triumphant version of the story tends to quietly skip over. The mud, the stench, the men squatting and groaning and weeping in the latrine pits, dying slowly in a way that no poet who ever lived wanted to put into a stirring speech. It happened again and again across the period, at siege after siege. At one long English siege in France in the previous century, reinforcements had to be sent over constantly just to replace the men being lost to disease and desertion, the army quietly bleeding men into the latrines the whole time it sat outside the walls. At another siege a few years after Harfleur, it's been estimated that something like 1 in 16 of the besieging soldiers died of dysentery and smallpox together, the two diseases working the camp side by side. The pattern was so consistent that a commander planning a siege had to think of disease as an enemy in its own right. An enemy that would attack his own side, that grew stronger the longer he sat in one place, and that no wall or weapon could keep out. You didn't have to lose a battle to lose an army. You just had to stay still long enough, and the kings themselves were not safe from it, and that's almost the most striking thing of all about it. King John of England, the one everybody loves to hate, the villain of the Robin Hood stories, died of it in 1216. He was in the middle of a war against his own rebellious barons, with everything going badly for him, and he fell ill with dysentery and grew steadily worse until he could no longer travel at all, and he died in a castle in the dead of night. Later, legends dressed the death up considerably, claiming he had been poisoned, or that he died from gorging himself sick on peaches or on a surfeit of new ale, because apparently dying of the flux just wasn't a dramatic enough end for a proper villain. But the flux is, in all likelihood, simply what took him in that castle. Henry V, the great victor of that famous battle, the celebrated warrior king, died of it too. 7 years on from Harfleur, he was laying siege to yet another town through a long, cold, wet winter in a filthy camp, and he caught the very same disease that had thinned his army back at the start. He grew so weak that he could no longer sit on a horse. The conqueror, the man who had humbled all of France, the figure of English military legend, had to be carried in a litter, which for a king of his particular pride and reputation would have been a humiliation all its own. He was taken to a castle just outside Paris, and he died there in the late summer of 1422, around 35 years old, leaving behind an infant son, only months old, that he had never once laid eyes on, and now never would. Genuine debate ran at the time about exactly what had killed him. A few different diseases got floated by the chroniclers, but dysentery is by far the most probable answer. Picked up in the muck and filth of a siege he was actually in the process of winning. The Black Prince went the same way. Edward, the heir to the English throne who never lived to be king. After a hard, grinding campaign down in Spain, he came home chronically and seriously ill, and one chronicle makes the horrifying claim that a huge portion of his army died of dysentery and other diseases on that single campaign. He lingered on for years afterward, sick and declining, carried in a litter to direct yet another siege when he could barely sit upright on a horse, and he died in 1376 before his own father the king, so that the crown skipped right over him to his young son. The traditional story is that some chronic form of dysentery slowly wore him down across all those years. Though I'll be honest with you that more recent medical detective work has questioned that and floated several other possibilities, malaria and other long-term conditions among them. The record of a person's symptoms read across the gap of so many centuries is never anywhere near as clean and certain as we would like it to be. But a long, wasting, undignified illness, very possibly with the flux somewhere at the root of it, took a prince in the very prime of his life and quietly rewrote the entire succession of a kingdom. The greatest soldier of his generation, the man France had feared, spent his final years being carried about like an invalid, his body emptied out by something he'd most likely picked up from bad water on campaign, dying by inches in his own country while everyone waited for a rain that never came. The Crusades, in particular, were a feast for the disease. Armies of men crossing into hot, unfamiliar countries, drinking water their bodies had never encountered before, living in crowded camps with no sanitation, exhausted and often half-starved, made just about the most vulnerable population imaginable. Crusade after crusade lost more men to disease and to dysentery especially than to all the fighting put together. The great enemy on those expeditions was rarely the army on the other side. It was the latrine and the well and the invisible thing that moved between them. Even a sainted king couldn't outrank it. Louis IX of France, the same king whose royal dynasty claimed the healing touch for scrofula that we talked about earlier, died on crusade in North Africa near the city of Tunis in 1270. His army had landed in brutal, punishing heat into a place with bad water and no possible way to keep a large camp clean, and disease tore through the men like a scythe. Dysentery and a savage outbreak of scurvy on top of it. As many as 1 man in 6 in the whole host died there. The chronicler who had been with the king on an earlier crusade left behind an account of the scurvy that is hard to shake out of your head once you've read it. He described how the men's gums rotted and swelled up so badly that the barbers had to physically cut away the dead, necrotic flesh from inside their mouths just so the soldiers could chew their food and swallow it. And he wrote that he heard grown men crying out and weeping under the barber's knife like women in the pains of childbirth. The king's own son died in that camp. Louis himself, weakened by his constant fasting and by his own relentless religious discipline, sick like all the rest of them, died there in the late summer, around 56 years old. Modern study of his actual remains points to severe scurvy as a major factor in his death, which complicates the old tidy story a little. But the broader picture stays exactly the same. A king, a saint, a man the church would later canonize, brought down in a stinking, dysentery-ridden camp by the very same forces that were killing his anonymous foot soldiers all around him. The flux did not pause to check your title or your holiness before it took you. He had actually suffered dysentery once before, on his earlier crusade, when he was captured by his enemies gravely ill with the flux, so weak he could barely sit a horse. The disease had nearly had him once already, years before it finally finished the job. And for all the kings and crusades, the flux did its heaviest work far from any battlefield, in ordinary homes, on ordinary people, and above all on the very young. The same disease that thinned armies also moved quietly through towns and villages every summer, through the markets and the shared wells and the close quarters of poor households, and it killed children in particular by the cartload. A small child who catches the flux dehydrates terrifyingly fast, far faster than an adult, and in a world with no understanding of how to replace the lost fluid safely, a healthy toddler could be gone within a few days of the first symptom. Whole families would lose more than 1 child in a single bad season. The grief of that, repeated across countless households in every generation, simply doesn't make it into the chronicles, because it was undramatic and ordinary, the everyday background death rate of the medieval world, the quiet, constant subtraction that everyone lived alongside and nobody could explain or stop. The bloody flux killed more medieval people than any sword ever did. And the great majority of them have no names we can read, no tombs we can visit. They were the babies and the children and the poor, taken by bad water in the heat of summer and then forgotten. Why was it so absolutely constant, this disease? Because the medieval world had no real grasp of sanitation as we would understand it. No water treatment, no germ theory, nothing at all to connect the latrine pit and the drinking well, except the invisible disease that travelled silently between the two of them. Now, medieval cities did sometimes have surprisingly strict rules about anything that might foul the public water supply, so it isn't that nobody had noticed that water mattered somehow. But the actual underlying mechanism, the thing that connected the waste to the sickness, was completely invisible to them, beyond their ability to see. So the flux was simply a permanent part of life, and a permanent part of death, the unglamorous, ever-present companion of every army that ever marched and every crowded town that ever stood. The disease that filled more graves than the sword and got the very least credit for it of anything in this whole story. Now, smallpox. If dysentery was the disease that nobody wanted to talk about, then smallpox was the one that nobody on earth could possibly ignore, because it left its permanent signature carved into the faces of the survivors for the rest of their lives. And in the medieval period and the centuries on either side of it, an absolutely enormous share of the population carried that signature on their skin. The disease came on hard and fast once it finally got going. After a stretch of incubation, 10 days or so, where the infected person felt nothing at all and went about their life normally, there would come a sudden, violent onset, a splitting headache, a deep grinding ache in the back, a high burning fever. Then the rash began. Small red spots first, that rose up into raised bumps, that filled with clear fluid and became blisters, that then filled with pus and became the dreaded pustules. And they spread relentlessly over the entire body, thickest across the face and the limbs, but truly everywhere, and crucially not only on the skin. They erupted inside the mouth, they erupted down the throat, they erupted on the surface of the eyes. The pustules invaded every pore and every opening of the body, and they gave off a particular, distinctive, sickening smell that the nurses and the family members who tended the sick learned to recognize instantly, and then never managed to forget for the rest of their own lives. For roughly a month, the disease ran its full course, the pustules eventually drying and scabbing over, and in the people who survived it, the fever finally broke, and the scabs dried up and fell away and left their marks behind. And the part in the middle, the worst of it, was simply agony. Consider a body where every inch of skin is occupied, where there is nowhere to lie that doesn't press on an open sore, where the pustules in the throat make it painful to swallow, and the ones in the mouth make it painful to eat or drink, and where the fever burns on top of all of it. No position brought relief. No part of the body was left out of it. People in the grip of the full disease often couldn't bear to be touched, couldn't be comfortably moved, couldn't do anything but endure it and wait to see which way it would go. And the waiting was its own torture for the family, because for the first week or so of the rash there was often no way to tell whether this was going to be a case the person survived or one of the bleeding cases that almost nobody survived. You just sat with them and you watched the pustules and you hoped. The death rate of the serious form of the disease was brutal, varying from around a fifth of those infected to well over half, depending on the exact form and on the particular population it struck. And in small children, it was worse still, in some times and places, killing the overwhelming majority of the infants who caught it, a fact that hollowed out families with a regularity that's hard for us to really feel now. The forms of the disease that bled, where the pustules turned dark and purple with blood pooling under the skin, were very nearly always a death sentence, with almost nobody surviving them. And even survival itself came at a heavy and lasting price. The pustules left behind deep, permanent pits in the skin, the pockmarks, especially across the face, permanent and unmistakable and impossible to hide. And the eyes, when the disease got into them, scarred over badly, so that a real and substantial portion of survivors came out the other side of the illness blind. In the centuries when smallpox was at its absolute height, the corneal scarring from this one single disease was among the very leading causes of blindness across an entire continent. In some accounts, a full third of survivors lost their sight to it. So you could fight your way through the fever and the pustules and the smell. You could survive the thing that killed so many around you, and still come out of it having lost your face and your eyes both. The clinical understanding we have for telling smallpox apart from other rashes owes a tremendous debt to a brilliant Persian physician of the medieval Islamic world, a man often known in the West as Rhazes, who lived around the 9th and 10th centuries. He wrote a treatise on smallpox and measles that was the first really careful, accurate clinical account to clearly separate the two diseases from one another, describing the distinct course of each one, telling physicians exactly how to tell them apart at the bedside. He also understood something that would not be fully explained for another 1,000 years, that a person who survived smallpox simply never caught it again. They were immune for the rest of their life. This was actually old knowledge, reaching all the way back into antiquity, where survivors were the obvious and natural choice to be sent in to nurse the sick, precisely because everyone already knew from long observation that they could not catch the disease a second time. His work was translated into Latin and went on to shape the way European physicians handled the disease for centuries afterward. The disease was already firmly established in Western Europe well before the height of the medieval period. A bishop in 6th century Gaul left an eyewitness account of an outbreak, and around the same time another churchman gave the disease the Latin name that would stick to it for a very long time. So smallpox wasn't some late arrival. It had been moving through Europe, killing and scarring and blinding for the better part of 1,000 years before the period we're talking about even ended. And a disease that's always present, endemic, never quite gone, has a particular effect on the people who live under it. It stops feeling like a catastrophe and starts feeling like a fact of life, a tax that childhood simply levied on a family, with no telling in advance which of the children it would take and which it would merely mark. Parents in many places half expected to lose at least one child to it, and counted themselves fortunate if the survivors came through with their sight intact and only a moderate scattering of scars. The treatments were, as you've probably come to expect by now, a strange mixture of the useless and the frankly bizarre. Following the old inherited advice, physicians for a very long time relied on heat, wrapping their patients up tightly in heavy blankets to make them sweat, on the theory that this would help bring the pox out faster and more completely. My personal favorite among all the strange medieval treatments, though, is the red one. An English royal physician in the early 14th century wrote, in all seriousness, that smallpox ought to be treated with the color red. The patient was to be wrapped in red cloth. The bed was to be hung with red. The curtains red, the hangings red, everything within sight of the sick person red. He claimed with considerable pride that he had cured a son of the King of England this very way, and had brought him through the disease without leaving so much as a single mark on his skin. And the strange thing about it is that the red treatment stuck around for centuries afterward, long outliving the man who first wrote it down. An English queen was wrapped in red when she fell ill with smallpox. A law passed in colonial Massachusetts much later actually required that a red cloth be hung up to mark an infected house. No medicine whatsoever lived in the redness, of course, but the belief in it outlived its author by a very, very long time. The one piece of practical wisdom they did have, and it was real, was the knowledge that a person who'd already survived the disease couldn't catch it again. So when smallpox broke out in a household or a village, it was often the survivors, the ones already pitted and scarred from their own bout years before, who stepped in to nurse the sick, carrying the bedding, cleaning the sores, sitting with the dying, because everyone understood they were safe to do it. Something quietly moving sits in that, the scarred tending the soon-to-be scarred, the people the disease had already marked, taking on the dangerous work precisely because it had already done its worst to them. Beyond that, though, medieval care for a smallpox patient came down to keeping them warm or cool, keeping them fed and watered if they could swallow, and waiting. No way existed to stop the disease, no way to ease the worst of it, no way to spare the eyes or prevent the scarring. A family could only tend the body and hope, and try not to let the rest of the household catch it, which, in a single crowded room with no understanding of how it spread, was very nearly impossible. People understood smallpox the way they understood nearly all of these afflictions, as something that had been sent to them on purpose. In Christian Europe, a great many people believed that God himself had sent it as a punishment for sin. In India, there was a goddess associated with the disease, one who both sent it and could be persuaded to cure it. In Japan, it was blamed on a particular demon, and people tried to appease it with shrines and offerings. Across the whole of the medieval world, from one end of it to the other, the disease was a constant and unavoidable presence, so common, so woven into ordinary life, that surviving it and then carrying the scars was simply part of what a great many human faces looked like. We have grown so completely used to faces without pockmarks that it's easy to forget how recent and how fragile that change actually is. For the overwhelming majority of human history, a great many of the faces around you, in any crowd, in any market, would have carried the permanent memory of this one disease written across them. And now the last one, and the strangest one of all, the disease that almost sounds invented the very first time you hear someone describe what it did. Ergotism. They called it Saint Anthony's fire, and the holy fire, and the sickness of the burning ones, and once you actually understand what the thing did to a human body, you understand exactly why the idea of fire kept turning up in every single name they ever gave it. It came from bread. That's the quiet horror sitting underneath all of it. It came from the daily bread. Specifically, it came from rye, which was the bread grain of the poor, when that rye got infected with one particular fungus. The fungus grew on the grain in damp, cold conditions, especially after a wet winter followed by a soggy spring, forming little dark purplish growths right where the healthy kernels of grain should have been. People harvested it, ground it up together with all the rest of the grain, baked it into their bread, and ate it, with absolutely no idea that anything was wrong with it. And the poison locked inside that fungus did one of two terrible things, depending partly on where in Europe you happened to live, and which of its compounds happened to dominate in your particular bread. The first form of the disease went after the blood vessels. The poison clamped the small vessels in the arms and the legs tightly shut, choking off the supply of blood to the hands and the feet. So it began with a sensation of burning, an intense, searing burning and tingling in the extremities, even though nothing at all was actually on fire, the dying nerves screaming out that the limbs were being cooked alive. Then the burning gave way to a deep coldness as the blood stopped reaching the tissue altogether. Then the tissue simply died. The fingers, the toes, the hands, the feet, and in the worst cases, the whole limbs turned cold, then dark, then black, and dried out and mummified right there on the still living person, and eventually the dead, blackened, mummified limb would separate itself from the body at a joint, and the precise detail the medieval writers couldn't stop returning to was this, that the dead limb came away without any pain at all, and without any bleeding, because the part was already entirely dead before it dropped. A person could lose a hand, a foot, an entire arm or leg, the limb simply detaching itself, dry and black and lifeless, while they went on living and breathing and talking. One early chronicle described a great plague of swollen blisters that consumed people with a loathsome rot, so that their very limbs loosened and fell off of them before death finally came. The second form of the disease skipped the limbs entirely and went straight for the nervous system instead. Convulsions, violent, painful muscle spasms that twisted and contorted the whole body into shapes a body shouldn't make. A crawling, creeping, maddening sensation on the skin, exactly as if things were moving around underneath it. Splitting headaches, vomiting, diarrhea, and madness. Real madness, hallucinations and full psychosis, people seeing and hearing things that simply weren't there, and behaving in ways that terrified everyone around them. The poison in the fungus is, as it happens, chemically related to LSD, so the visions were not in any sense a metaphor or an exaggeration. People were quite literally tripping, in agony, convulsing, in the middle of a famine, with no possible way of understanding what was happening to them or why. And there's a rough geographic split that historians have long noticed in the records, where outbreaks to the west of the Rhine tended toward the gangrenous, limb-destroying form, while outbreaks to the east of it tended toward the convulsive, mind-destroying form, most likely for reasons to do with which specific toxins dominated and what else people in those regions were eating alongside the rye. To the people living through a convulsive outbreak, with no notion of fungus or poison, what they were seeing must have looked like the world coming apart. Whole villages where people fell down, twitching and seizing, neighbors clawing at their own skin, swearing they could feel things crawling on them that nobody else could see. People raving, seeing visions, screaming at things that weren't there, the children as well as the adults. And all of it arriving together, in a cluster, in the same village, after the same wet harvest, eating the same bread. If you had no concept of what was actually causing it, the obvious explanations were the ones your whole culture handed you. A curse, a possession, the work of the devil, or of someone in league with the devil. People reaching for the only frameworks they had, in a community that had quite literally been poisoned together, all of them looking for someone or something to blame for a horror with no visible cause. The outbreaks came in waves across the centuries, and they came at their very worst in the hungry years, in the famine years, because that's precisely when desperate, starving people ate every last scrap of grain they had, including the spoiled, dark, fungus-ridden portions they would have thrown to the pigs in any normal year. The records reach back a long way. There's a 9th century chronicle that describes a great plague of swollen blisters consuming the people with a loathsome rot, so that their limbs loosened and dropped away before they died, about as clear a description of the gangrenous form as you could ask for from 1,000-odd years ago. The records describe a terrible outbreak in France in the 10th century that killed thousands, with the traditional figures running well up into the tens of thousands, though I'd treat those exact numbers gently, because medieval death tolls were almost never actually counted with any care and tend to balloon in the retelling. The dating of these early outbreaks gets reported inconsistently from source to source, too, the same event sometimes sliding by decades depending on who's telling it, so the broad picture is more trustworthy than any single date. Another such outbreak swept through the Rhine Valley in the 11th century. A chronicler writing around that time described an epidemic that turned people's limbs black as coal, an epidemic from which the sufferers either died miserably or else survived having permanently lost their hands and their feet to it. A later historian, writing about one of these medieval French outbreaks, described the scene without flinching from any of it, the cries and the screaming of the suffering, the sight of charred, blackened limbs being shed from living bodies, and a stench of rotting flesh hanging over everything that he said was simply, flatly unbearable. Whole regions of poor farming families, eating their own daily bread, watching their own bodies and the bodies of their children blacken and dry out and come apart at the joints. And it wasn't only people. The animals suffered it too. Cattle losing their hooves and the ends of their tails to the same blackening rot, their milk drying up, dying alongside the families that depended on them, so that a bad year of ergot could hollow out a whole community, its people and its livestock at once. Out of all that horror came an order of monks who dedicated themselves entirely to caring for the sufferers. The Order of St. Anthony, founded in France around the very end of the 11th century, after a nobleman's son was said to have been cured of the disease at the shrine of St. Anthony the Great, the ancient Egyptian hermit. The order spread enormously across the continent, eventually running on the order of several hundred hospitals scattered across France and Germany and Scandinavia, staffed by thousands of brothers, a vast network of care built up around this one strange burning sickness. The brothers of the order wore black robes, and they rang little bells as they went about collecting alms for their work, and by a special church privilege they were allowed to keep pigs that roamed freely through the medieval streets, so that the bell and the pig both became part of the imagery of the saint himself. They didn't only feed the sufferers either, they gave them a special medicinal wine, infused with herbs and steeped with the relics of the saint, which they believed carried his healing power, and the long pilgrimage to reach a hospice in the first place may itself have done some good, simply by getting people moving and improving the circulation in limbs that were starving for blood. And at their hospices, the sufferers and the grateful survivors left behind their amputated limbs, the blackened, dried, mummified hands and feet, displayed openly at the shrines, kept in some places so that their former owners might one day reclaim them at the resurrection of the dead at the end of all things. A chapel wall hung with the dried, dark relics of people's own lost hands and feet, left there as offerings and as proof of survival both. It's an image that stays with you, and here, right at the very end, is the quiet, accidental mercy buried in the heart of the whole grim story, the one thing in this entire video that comes anywhere close to a happy turn, so let me give it its proper moment. The monks actually helped people. They genuinely did. And they had absolutely no idea why it worked. When a sufferer came to one of their hospitals, the monks took them in and they fed them. They fed them bread made from wheat and food grown fresh in the monastery's own gardens, food that was completely free of the rye fungus that was the actual source of all the agony. So simply by removing the poison from the person's daily diet, just by feeding them clean, uncontaminated bread, the symptoms eased off and the disease retreated and the burning stopped. The monks thought it was the saint doing it. They thought it was the holy relics, the blessed wine they administered, the long pilgrimage the sufferers had made to reach them. And the people who got better thought exactly the same thing, and they gave heartfelt thanks for the miracle, and they left their own blackened hands hanging on the chapel wall as tokens of their gratitude and their survival. They were entirely right that they had been saved. They were just completely wrong about how it had happened. The real cure was the clean bread, handed over by men who sincerely believed they were channeling the power of a long-dead saint, and who, precisely in their not knowing, in their total ignorance of the real mechanism, did more genuine good for the suffering poor than nearly any of the trained physicians in this entire story managed to do, with all of their elaborate theories and their bleeding and their mercury and their red cloth. A theory floats around here, and I want to flag it very clearly as a theory because it's debated and it's a long way from being proven, that some of the famous episodes of so-called bewitchment in later centuries, the convulsions and the visions and the strange, frightening behavior, might in fact have been outbreaks of convulsive ergotism, breaking out in communities that ate a great deal of rye after an especially wet growing season. Some historians have made a careful case for it. Other historians find it entirely unconvincing and have argued against it, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend to you that the matter is settled because it isn't, but it is a haunting thought to sit with. The idea that the crawling skin and the seizures and the visions All the things that people once confidently blamed on curses and on devils and on witchcraft may sometimes have been nothing more than a fungus quietly growing in the daily bread, poisoning the very poorest people at the very worst possible moment, when the harvest had already failed and there was nothing left in the house to eat but the one thing that was slowly killing them. That's where I'll leave the burning ones, in the chapel hung with their own blackened hands, fed clean bread by monks who were certain they were performing a miracle, and who were, in the only way that could possibly have mattered to a starving family, watching their children's fingers turn black, exactly and completely right. Thanks for staying with me through all of that. If you made it this far, you've got a stronger stomach than most, and I appreciate you spending the time down here in the darker corners of the medieval world with me. Tell me in the comments which of these 6 got under your skin the most, because it's never the one I expect. If something here stuck with you, hit subscribe so the next one finds you. Look after yourself, keep an eye on your bread, and I'll catch you in the next one.